So first and foremost, this is our real GDP to the selected advanced economies that realistically matter to us. Highlight the US, and you can see the US is over, fifth from the left in terms of where it sits. I'd probably also highlight the UK. Then you look at where we are comparing ourselves to. So we are sitting at the wrong end of this chart, and we are not showing signs of competitiveness. We are not showing signs of adapting, and we are also not showing signs of aspiration. That word is deliberate, because a government's job, we talked about just before the RBA's release, about where government sort of priorities sit. Government's priorities between balancing aspiration and fairness. When I say fairness, that means, Ben's word is, or the sentence is, no one left behind. That's part of it, and that's fine. Governments can have that mandate, but if it comes at the point of view that there isn't actually aspiration, it's just allowing overall fairness to take over, you don't actually get growth.
If you don't grow the economic pie,
Yep.
you can't bring everyone along on the journey.
Which explains the next chart. So this is the other thing to remember, is that the quarter we've just had was the first time in 7 quarters that we've actually finally got out of what should be used in the GDP figures, which is per capita. This is basically remaining and taking out things like migration. All things being equal, we have been in a recession for 7 quarters until we finally popped out of it. So it's 8 out of the last 10 quarters. The household has gone backwards. And that's what this shows. This is basically showing that the household, despite the fairness techniques that are apparently put in by certain governments of all persuasions, that overall the economy isn't coping with where we sit. Because it brings us to the chart that I know Ben loves the most when I showed it to him.
Oh, it just goes to show you how is the economy running? It's running on debt.
Yeah. This is an unsustainable chart scenario. This is the kind of stuff that Europe has been doing for decades and has found ourselves in trouble. I'm not advocating for one side of politics or the other. What I am saying is that this, if you can see this trend took off under the Abbott government, right? This is 2014. And you can see that even looking through COVID, government spending, for obvious reasons, was absolutely ramped up. And that was under the Morrison government. And then we've had a scenario where we did start to see the cost of living come in, and that's what Ben's pointing to in that little green bit down. Hang on a minute, the current government couldn't be slugged with the cost of living scenario and seeing mass unemployment. That would be bad for them. So the ramp up in spending was there. So I know you want to get to the next chart coming up, which is around employment, because it perfectly illustrates that in another way.
Well, yes, so it's a couple of charts away, but let's just quickly analyse what's happened from the employment story, because one of the reasons why interest rates are holding where they are is because employment is still so strong.
Yeah. There is an argument at the moment that, for instance, there's a positive to what's been happening in the employment market, which is that there is more women in employment now than there has ever been in history. Yep. Part of the reason they're doing that is that dual income families are required to actually deal with the living standards that we need and the living standards required, but also to deal with what Ben's just talking about before, which is that because everybody is still, inverted commas, employed, we have high rates of mortgages, it's probably elevated and kept inflation going for longer than it probably needed to. It's horrible, people losing their jobs, not denying that at all. But this is the question that will be debated in theory over the next 20 years, is that during this period, should we have actually ripped the Band-Aid off and taken the hurt, or should we have prolonged it? And we won't know the answer to that question for another 10 years.
Well, you'll never know the answer, because they're all hypotheticals in terms you'll never actually know.
Point.
But I think from that point of view, women are aspirational. They've got their own,
and so they should be
sports, and they it's brilliant. It's absolutely fantastic. But to your point, it adds more money into the economy, and that obviously then does push prices higher. But
it also explains the employment figures in the fact that what they're doing is that it actually shows the household, to survive, is making decisions that they didn't normally have to do. So if you look at the amount of full-time work to part-time work, that's fascinating, along with the underemployment figure. So the underemployment figure shows that actually more and more people now are actually in work. They actually are gaining a level of employment that they need.
Yep.
So those women may actually be working part-time, but it's enough to sustain it. So there's so much data in the employment figures that show the household has physically changed forever, which I think is a very positive thing.
Yep.
But it's also a reaction to the scenario that their living standards find themselves in.
So the trade-off is how heavy the bottoming out would have been.
Yep.
And off the back of this, and this is what we see in this particular chart here, this is a chart that just brings it all home. there's the public sector jobs versus the private sector jobs and the total jobs overall. So we've seen a complete revision or reversion, I should say, in terms of really you want public sector to be driving the investment and driving the jobs growth. We didn't see that. What we've seen is increased government spending to be able to keep those jobs afloat. So that's how they've been able to land the plane in terms of not seeing a harder economic landing. But the byproduct of that is higher interest rates for longer.
Yeah, so the runway's longer.
Yeah, that's right. The runway is going to be longer, and we haven't seen, because in theory, private sector have done their job in terms of taking the heat because there's not enough, they've got to find cost savings and so forth. So ultimately, they're not employing more people and they're expecting higher productivity. But they've all turned to this government-driven public sector work in the care economy and also in back office and administration and all that type of stuff. So that's where I get a little bit annoyed in terms of the waste and, the decisions that we're making about when we are talking about not leaving no one behind. My view on that is people need to have aspiration. The best form of satisfaction and purpose is to have a job, and add to the community and be a positive net contributor rather than a positive net taker. And so that's what we want to see, because if everyone just knows that they can take the foot off the accelerator and do nothing and get housing and get free healthcare and all of the other things, that's not the society we want to build. That's not aspirational. And all of those other people are working harder to grow the pie only to get their take, more of their earnings being taken away to support the community. That's the delicate balance that we're trying to get.